This week on Reverberate, we're asking why anyone would spy out Christian freedom and try to pull a church back into slavery. Galatians points to a deeper motive: status, control, and the craving to be made much of. Today we trace how self-righteousness steals joy and how grace restores rest in Christ. In Galatians 2, it describes the circumcision party that was causing this discord as false brothers secretly brought in who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they may bring us into slavery. What was the motivation behind these? It's easy to think of them as the bad guys of the story. What was their motivation? Why were they coming in to spy out our freedom and to bring slavery?
I think one thing that we have in this case is Paul tells us some of that later in the book. So in chapter 4, Paul is talking to the Galatians and he says, "Have I become your enemy by telling you the truth?" And he says, "They," by which he means the false teachers, "they make much of you, but for no good purpose. They want to shut you out that you may make much of them." In other words, he's saying that they're coming to the Galatians, in some ways lifting up the Galatians. Hey, you guys can really have a better standing. You can do some things that will make this better, and you need to live in this way. He's coming to make much of them. But Paul says they make much of you for no good reason. They want to shut you out so that you make much of them. So it's actually self-serving to make themselves look better. We do this. C.S. Lewis wrote about this, the inner circle of friendship, and how we always want to be in the inner. We want to be in the inner circle. And one of the reasons we make inner circles is because we feel better about ourselves. So we shut people out and say, well, if you come act more like me, then you're in a better spot. That makes me feel better about who I am, is the point. And so I think probably, now that's Galatians 4, that's what Paul says. This is trying to guess a little bit what they actually were thinking. My guess is these teachers really believed they were earning favor with God by living the way that they were living. I don't think they were coming knowing they taught a lie. I don't think they were coming knowing this was a problem for the Galatians. I think they really believed it. And the thing is, if I really believe that what I'm doing gives my soul rest, gives my soul favor with God, if I really believe that, then I almost have to put down others who don't do it in some way. I have to say, you need to do this. If what I'm relying on for the value of my life is performance, I do the things well enough. Then if I say, you don't have to do these things in order to be right with God, I've just cut at the value of my own life. So these teachers are probably just as enslaved as what Paul is saying the Galatians would be. They're coming saying, I'm going to earn favor by my performance. And in order to kind of keep the show, the facade of their life that, oh, my life has value and this performance is really important, in order to keep that as something that's valuable, they have to tell others, see, you need to perform in this exact same way. It's one of the reasons that we know when someone is eager to say, here's all the rules for how you live better, they're relying on those rules themselves in some way. That's why they do it. And I think that motive, since Paul brings it out in chapter 4 of what they're actually doing, it's they make much of you. They say, here's your opportunity. Why? Because they want to be made much of themselves. To say, here's how my self-righteousness is built on these things. And that's what it comes down to. When we're relying on self-righteousness, we have to put down the people who don't measure up to our standard. Not because we're angry and malicious towards them, but because our whole sense of worth is built on it. And so as soon as you turn that around, they're so enslaved too, actually, that they have to try and enslave others. Now that sounds so harsh, but if you say, my life is built on my productivity, I do all these things, that's what makes my life worth living, then you have to try and say to somebody else, you really ought to be productive. You've got to do that. Why? Because if they don't, their life has less value in your eyes. And if it's okay for them to not be so productive, then what am I even doing? Our self-righteousness is always, we measure ourselves by that standard, and so we always try to enslave others to it, if that's our standard, is performance. If it's grace, then we go instead and say, I have the undeserved favor of God. Here's what he has done for me. And we can look on somebody else with grace because we have received that same grace.
It's like a really bad spiritual pyramid scheme. Get people to follow in your footsteps that validates what you're doing. And it's like an expanding kingdom of slavery.
I think that's exactly what it is. It's this sense of if I am resting in this, then it's not just that I want somebody else to, it's that my whole life is built on this way of thinking. This is why it can be difficult for good people, in one sense, morally, ethically good people, to come to the gospel because they have built their whole life on these good works. Somehow, in some religious or irreligious scheme, these good works are going to outweigh my bad. And when somebody brings the gospel to them and they hear, all those good works can't earn me anything, their whole sense of like fulfillment and worth in their life has been built on those good works. If you take that away, they feel like there's nothing here. What on earth is my life built on? And that's what the gospel does, though. It does. It cuts at those things. That's actually good news, because all those things we look to for self-righteousness, the righteousness we try to build is never good enough, because we do fail. And even if we somehow manage to not fail in big ways, we say it's never enough. I still feel like my soul can never really rest. It's never enough. And there's no forgiveness if you fail. So it's actually good news to have your self-righteousness cut down. I am sure Paul would say, I want these false teachers to turn from their slavery. But the book of Galatians isn't written to them. It's written to the people who are hearing those false teachers. And that's why he's strong there. And he's not going after them like they're completely just misunderstood. He's saying, no, they are trying to pervert your understanding of the gospel and rob you of grace and rob you of rest in Jesus Christ. And he will not put up with that at all. But I'm sure if Paul were sitting down talking with that person, he would say, you need to turn from your self-righteousness just like Paul did, because he was the same guy. Paul was this same kind of false teacher. He was saying you need to keep the Mosaic law and not believe in Jesus. He persecuted people over it. And he realized everything I did was not good enough. He says, I count it all as rubbish for the joy of knowing Jesus Christ. Paul moved from being this kind of false teacher to being a believer. So he's looking at them going, I know what it's like to trust in self-righteousness. I know why you pursue that self-righteousness. It's so that you'll feel better about yourself. That's why you try to rope others into this same slavery. And he draws them back to the gospel.
It's easy to think of these people that came in that were disturbing the Galatians as the bad guys of the book. But if I'm honest, I think what would have it been like to be in the Galatian church? And I feel like it'd be easy to view these people as Christians. They came in, they're claiming Christ, they say they're coming from Jerusalem, and then they're presenting this new information. But Paul deals with them very harshly. And I'm trying to think realistically, how did Paul have that wisdom? You know, he calls them false brothers. He treats them like they're not even Christians. They're presenting a false gospel. He says, let them be accursed, which is pretty strong language. So how did he have the wisdom of knowing how to address these people? Because I think if you hear someone that says something maybe a little off theologically, it's easy to either excuse it or to think of it as, oh, maybe they're a new Christian or whatever, and you just look past it. So when do you draw that line of looking past someone who's maybe a little bit off theologically, but they're growing, versus coming down as harshly as Paul did on these people?
I think the posture of that person is important. These people are presenting themselves as teachers. So if someone is teaching in a local church context enough that Paul thought he had to write to the churches at Galatia, there's not one church, it's the churches of Galatia. So Paul thought these people have so presented themselves as teachers that they are infecting a geographical region of true believers with a subtle but deadly distortion of the key core components of Christianity, the gospel. That's what he responds to so strongly. It's not, hey, this guy just got converted in Galatia and he is a Gentile and he's been listening to some Jews and thought, maybe I need to follow that. That's not the kind of language Paul is using for those kinds of people. He's talking about false teachers. So I think the teacher element is one piece, and I think the strength with which The more it's directly connected to the gospel is another piece. So if someone wants to talk about some idea of a specific theological concept that you say, okay, this is not really core to the gospel. It's something that's an interesting conversation. What does this mean? Why does he use this phrase? Maybe it's meaningful to them, but it's not the core of the gospel. That's why Paul says, I delivered unto you as of first importance. There are some things that are of first importance, and there are some things that are not of first importance. When he talks about engaging with believers who disagree, he says, be fully convinced in your own mind, observe day, don't observe this day, eat this food, don't eat this food. There's a lot of issues to have that conversation with. When he says, trust in the grace of God through Jesus, or try to earn God's favor in addition to that grace, that's one of the things he speaks very strongly against. And I think those two pieces, is it about the gospel? Are they posturing as a teacher? That's what's going to drive you to a harsher response, if you will, a more almost combative. He is combative. He's fighting false teaching in that sense. In other words, this is a shepherd saying, this is a wolf among the sheep who's going to eat sheep. I need to fight that wolf. We do need wisdom. We need God's grace. There are nuanced, difficult situations where you go, is this that? Or is this a sheep who is still understanding and growing and maybe views it differently, and maybe they're right and maybe some of these other people are wrong? We need wisdom, and sometimes that's hard, but I think those are the big categories. Is, are they a teacher, and is this related to the gospel?
Yeah, and there's two things particularly in the second chapter of Galatians that point that out, I think, very strongly. In verse 4, he describes them as like false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out, like purpose, our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into slavery. And then verse 5 is really striking. To them we did not yield in submission, even for a moment, which implies that they were posturing themselves as authorities. Do you see that? So we didn't submit to them. So it's very clear that the posture that they took was the posture of teachers and authorities. And then to piggyback off of those who are not assuming that posture, let's read verses 11 through 14 and onwards, because I think it's very revealing the way he deals with Cephas compared to the rest. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. Now listen to this, verse 14. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the gospel, with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, he recognizes that people fell along with Peter, but who was his public rebuke towards? Peter, not everybody. I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? So I just think it's very revealing, that principle of authority figures posturing themselves in a certain way that have influence, they have a following. Again, the whole region of Galatia seemed to be infected by this dabbling with this heresy, essentially. And then we see, even when someone's conduct is not a step in the gospel, even though there's a whole group of people following suit, the leader is the one who's called out. In the case, Peter obviously holds a very prominent position as an apostle.
As we continue through Galatians in this series, we'll keep exploring what it means to live in the freedom of grace rather than the burden of performance. Each step reminds us that real rest is found in Christ alone. Stay with us as we keep walking through this letter and learning how the gospel shapes our faith and our life together.